So, last time I preached was, does anyone remember? Jehovah Rohi, that beautiful, intimate, rich metaphor of the shepherd and his sheep. Wasn't it powerful? Well, what a jump. Here we are, a chunky, solid, dry, theological treatise, right in the middle as Paul's gearing up his argument. Okay, that is a fair jump, but at least it should mean I'll be able to get through without crying, you'd think. Maybe. We'll see. So here we are in Romans 2. And maybe it's just me, but I haven't found this as I looked for it, but there seems to be an obvious parallel between Paul and Romans and C.S. Lewis and Mere Christianity. Both very intelligent guys explaining, unpacking how Christianity works. It seems sort of obvious. They've also got something else in common. Mere Christianity was originally, does anyone know? It was talks, radio talks. BBC asked C.S. Lewis to talk to the people. And who wrote Romans? Who wrote Romans? It wasn't Paul, it was Tertius, his secretary. So Paul spoke it. So in a sense they were both spoken and written down. So a little bit of a parallel there. So there's Romans 2, got it, memorised it, thank you, we can go home. I'm going to take 3 little chunks there that I've coloured and see if we can get something out of it. Chunk 1 I've called Count the Fingers. So, first few verses. You therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else, for at whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things. We know that God's judgment against those who do such things is based on truth. So when you, a mere human being, pass judgment on them and yet do the same things, do you think you'll escape God's judgment? Or do you show contempt for the riches of His kindness, forbearance and patience, not realising that God's kindness is intended to lead you to repentance? What is he saying? Well, remember this story? Anyone know which story this is referring to? Jesus told a story about a Pharisee and a tax collector both going up to pray. Here it is, Luke 18. Jesus told the parable, 2 guys going up to pray. The Pharisee, big flowery language, thank God I'm not like these rotten sinners. Tax collector stays back at a distance, head down, beats his breast, asks God to have mercy. One goes home justified and the other doesn't. So, in this first few verses, Paul's talking to the Pharisee. And Jesus' picture sounds a little bit exaggerated, doesn't it? Have a read of this prayer, actual prayer of Rabbi Nehuniah. I give thanks to Thee, O Lord, my God, that Thou hast set my portion with those who sit in the house of learning, and Thou hast not set my portion with those who sit in street corners. For I rise early, and they rise early, but I rise early for works of Torah, and they rise early for frivolous talk. I labour and they labour, but I labour and receive a reward. They labour and do not receive a reward. I run and they run, but I run to the life of the future world, and they run to destruction. Oof. Ouch. Or this quote by Rabbi Simeon bar Yochai. If there are only 30 righteous people in all the world, I and my son would be among them. If there were but 20, I and my son would be of that number. If there were but 10, I and my son would be among them. Wonder where this is going. If there were but 5, I and my son would be of the 5. If there were but 2, I and my son would be among them. And if there were but 1, I myself would be the 1. Does anyone bristle with that sort of pride?
Yes. I think you need a bigger slide.
There was a belief amongst the Jews in Paul's day that they were not just better than the Gentiles, but they were not going to be judged. God would spare them. And what is Paul saying in this passage? You guys do not get off. You get judged too. You're actually condemning yourself. You're passing judgment on others, but you do the same things. God's judgment is good. It's sound. No loopholes, no expensive lawyers to get you off. God's judgment, He knows everything. He's impartial. You are not going to escape it. Remember some years ago, someone asked me, Andrew, what do you think of John MacArthur? I said, well, he's very critical. You know, whenever he talks about another Christian or a Christian group or a ministry, he always says what they do wrong. He never says what they do right. He's very critical. Did you notice that? What did I accuse him of? Being critical. And what did I just do? Did I talk about the good things that John does? No. So in that moment I did exactly what I accused him of. And sometimes we do that. But what Paul is saying, look, the Jews don't have to actually specifically do each of the sins they might be judging, but the fact is that they sin too. And if in our judgment we're saying, look, sin brings condemnation, then we're saying that we get condemnation too. Paul's reminding us that when you point a finger at someone, there are three pointing back at you. So before we get too indignant about the Pharisee, anyone notice themselves in that? We all do it. We find extenuating circumstances for ourselves that we don't give to someone else. We find them guilty without excuse. But we find just enough to cut us some slack and maybe the benefit of the doubt. We adjust the definition of guilty so that we're just on the right side of it. You might have heard the saying, an alcoholic is someone who drinks more than me. We might as well say a liar is someone who is more dishonest than I am. Or a thief is someone who steals more than I do. Or a greedy person or a selfish person, and so on. So imagine we've got this goodness scale. Let's have a think about this idea of a goodness scale. Imagine we're going to interview 3 people. We're going to ask them, how are you on this goodness scale? 0 is obviously very bad. 10's perfect. Now the 3 people we're going to interview, first guy is Max. Now Max is a murderer. I get to talk to murderers in jail. But as a murderer, this should be pretty easy, shouldn't it? We ask Max how he's going on the scale. This is what Max says. Sure, yeah, I killed a couple of people, but they had it coming. I was a hard worker. I wasn't a very good father or a partner, but, I had a rough start. I never really had a chance. I'm a lot better than most of the guys in here. In fact, I give myself 7 or 8. Okay, Max gives himself 7 or 8. Second person we're going to interview, incredibly good looking, someone like myself. So, Andrew, what are you going to say? Well, gee, I'm still very proud. I care too much about what people think. I do get a bit irritable when I've got to preach and I haven't got time. I can be a little bit obsessive about Pokemon. Sometimes my sermons go on and on. I try to help people, but often my motives are a bit dodgy. I guess I give myself a 3 or a 4. Third person we're going to interview, Mother Teresa. We ask her the same question. She laughs. She says, I'm a 1 and that's being generous. If you could see into my heart, you'd realise I'm lazy. I just don't love properly. I've got all these mixed motives. Self is all the way through. But it doesn't seem to bother her. She gives herself a 1. Feels she's being generous, but laughs at the whole idea. So what do you notice? The higher we are on the goodness scale, what happens? The more aware we are of how far we fall short, aren't we? We're more aware of even the good things we don't do for good motives. Or even if there are some good motives in there, mixed in amongst it are some not so good motives. So this whole idea that the more good we are, the less we might actually genuinely rate ourselves. So who was irked by the pride of that rabbi? Do you realise what was reacting to that pride? Your pride. So if we weren't proud, that would not irk us. So, Paul is saying we're all guilty. Pharisee, tax collector, publican, the King James has a publican in there, politicians. We're all sinners. We're condemned. And while we're sinning, we're judging others for the same sort of thing. And what does God do about it? Mostly nothing. Grace. That's right. Mostly there's nothing. Unlike, what happened to these guys? Ananias and Sapphira. What happened to them? They sold their property and they gave the money to the church. Well, that's a great thing to do, isn't it? Except they were asked, is this the whole amount? It wouldn't have mattered if it wasn't, but in order to look good they said, yeah, that's the whole amount. And what happened? Bang! They were struck dead. And what does the very next verse say? And everyone who heard was struck with great fear. Why would that strike you with great fear? We tell half-truths, don't we? Little white lies, little fibs. When I was living in Burke, I was the dean at Gidgee Lake Centre, and I was also working as a doctor in town. At the same time, Martin Watson, my good friend, was working as a doctor in town, and he was the dean at Pirabor. Something was coming up, I think it was mini muster. And I was given the job of getting a data projector. This is back in the days when data projectors were brand new. There was only a couple in town. The bulbs themselves were like $5,000. But the school had one. So I went to see the school principal to ask if he would loan us a data projector. As I walked in, the school principal said to me, I explained what I wanted. He said, Martin, you saved my life. Anything you want is yours. People did get us confused. So what did I say?
Thank you.
Thank you. So he's taking me to get the data projector and he says, how is Sandy? Sandy's Martin's lovely wife. This is another opportunity for me to tell the truth. And what did I say? She's fine, because she is fine. What if I had just preached a sermon on the importance of being completely truthful? That's sort of hypocrisy, isn't it? If we were God, there'd be a lot more lightning strikes, wouldn't there? He generally lets it go. Isn't that interesting? Does anyone know who this is? That's Quadjo. Quadjo and I spent some years together in Burke. He studied at Cornerstone before going back to Ghana to start a discipleship centre. The picture on the left there is the discipleship centre, and he told me a story about the centre was finished, it was built. All that was remaining was for someone to do the last connection of the power from the power lines to the centre. But some official wanted a bribe. So Quadjo met with this guy outside there where the power lines passed the centre, and this is sort of the conversation. I don't think you understand, Quadjo said. This is God's work. And the official said, okay, so give me some of God's money. Quadjo looks up and then he subtly steps away from the guy. And the guy looks up and he said, what? And Quadjo said, this is God's work. Do you really want to be the one who stands in the way of God's work? Does that seem like a safe place for you to stand? And what do you think the guy did? He made the connection and got home. He ran home as fast as he could. Quadjo would not have been surprised to see God strike out of a clear blue sky, because often in Africa they see a lot more of the spiritual battle. But we don't see it very often, do we? Generally the sinners go unstruck, even when we tell half-truths. Even when we blatantly lie, even when we do worse. And it's easy after a while to start taking that for granted, isn't it? We start to confuse God's patience for some sort of weakness. And Paul says, it is his kindness and his tolerance and his patience that you are taking for granted. It's supposed to make you think, this is a God worth following. I will surrender my life to him. But what you're actually doing is taking it for granted and in fact treating it with contempt. Does that seem like a safe thing for someone to do? It's not. God's patience and mercy has a limit. If you've broken the law, which we all have, you earn the wrath. Doesn't matter if you are better than someone else. The only way to escape the judgment and the wrath is to repent. Stop trying to pretend you're not guilty, that you're not as bad as someone else. Lay down your arms and surrender. Why are Jesus and Paul so big on humility and so down on pride?
Pride is the one thing that keeps us from God.
It's the thing that stops us from the healing that we need, isn't it? It's the barrier that stops us accepting what we need, our illness, receiving the cure and getting on with new life. And humility is the thing that is the beautiful context for all of that. So, chunk 2, the reality of the law. When outsiders who've never heard of God's law follow it more or less by instinct, they confirm its truth by their obedience. They show that God's law is not something alien, imposed on us from without, but woven into the very fabric of our creation. There's something deep within them that echoes God's yes and no, His right and wrong. We're talking about the moral law. And here's where Lewis can help us out. In the appendix of The Abolition of Man, he did some anthropological research. And he looked at several civilizations: Greek, Roman, Babylonian, Chinese, Hindu, North American Indian, Norse, Anglo-Saxon, several others. And he found that there was incredible similarity in their moral code. The whole idea that it evolves differently sociologically is blown out of the water by the facts. And he points out that when we talk, it's like we're assuming there is this moral code and that we're trying to draw people's attention to it. If I'm in line and you cut in, I say, whoa, hang on, what are you doing here? That's not right. So our arguments revolve around the fact that our case better fits this moral law than yours does. Whenever we talk about something being right or wrong, or even better or worse, or even the ideas of oughts and shoulds, we're using this moral law. It's a bit like me saying, I'm taller than you. If I mean that to be a meaningful statement, then we need some objective measure which we can both be put up against and actually measured against and see a difference. If there isn't an objective measure, the strongest thing I can say is, I feel taller at the moment. Without an objective standard, we can never say something is right or wrong. So imagine you're in a conversation with a postmodern atheist, and he says, those churches are so wrong to harbour those paedophiles. You could agree with them. You say, yeah, I think God's pretty angry at them too. Or you could say, wow, I didn't realise you believed in God. To which they would say, well, I don't. And you'd say, well, hang on a minute. You can't actually say something is actually wrong, meaningfully wrong, without a moral law. And if you accept an objective moral law, you need a moral lawgiver. Someone who cares about right and wrong, and us following right and wrong, and has left that sense in us. The strongest thing you can say is you don't like it at the time. But they want to do more than that. They actually want to condemn some things that they think are really wrong, not just wrong for them at the time, or that things are really right. They might want to say that kindness and compassion are meaningfully superior to cruelty, or that acceptance and love is better than hatred and discrimination. There's really only two possibilities. It's either all relative, or there is an absolute morality. If it's all relative, you can never talk about a society progressing, getting any better, taking children out of the mines and putting them into schools. giving women rights. They would argue our acceptance of the rights of gay marriage is moral progress. But hang on a minute, if we need moral progress, we need an objective moral scale to make that meaningful, which means we need God. As much as someone might put themselves forward as a moral relativist, in a couple of minutes they're going to be talking about shoulds and oughts and rights and wrongs, which shoots themselves in the foot. Of course, they'll explain away our moral sense as simply an evolution product. Herd survival. That's what it is, herd survival. There's a couple of problems with that. How does it help herd survival if I have a sense in me to go save someone who's in a drowning river? Well, it helps the herd because that person in the river's in the herd. Hang on a minute. I'm the herd too. How does that help me? But even more telling, we often have a combination of instincts going on within us. Maybe one to help, maybe one for our own safety, maybe for the safety of our family. And what do we do with those combination of instincts? We evaluate them with what the ancient philosophers called the tertium quid, which means, anyone speak Latin? The third thing. So we measure it up against a third thing. It's like you and I, who's the tallest? We measure against a third thing. Now, if this third thing helps us to sort out, assess instincts and choose between them, it can't itself be an instinct, can it? It's a bit like if we're coming to a house under construction, we're wondering if it's straight, we bring a spirit level to see if it's straight. You can't just grab a piece of wood off the building to hold it up against the building to see if it's straight. So an instinct can't evaluate an instinct. You need something locked into an objectivity outside of the building, like gravity or a plumb bob, to tell. And as much as an atheist wants to be a total relativist, they can't. They give themselves away. I have actually met a complete moral relativist once. Anyone know where I was?
University.
No. I was in an institution for the criminally insane. Looked a little bit like this guy. I was visiting, thank you. This guy had killed his wife and he talked about it as if he had made a cup of tea. Now, when is he getting out? Why can we never let him out? He has no moral compass. He can never be a member of society. Unlike a lot of the sort of professed relativists, this guy actually is a complete relativist. And where have we put him? Behind big bars and walls and razor wire. Okay. Scary guy. So someone says, all right, I just can't believe in God because of all the cruelty and injustice in the world. Well, hang on a minute. If there's no God, there's no moral law, so there's no such thing as injustice. As Lewis said, a man does not call a line crooked unless he's got a pretty clear idea of what a straight line is. So when we complain about injustice, it's only because we've got an inherent sense of justice. If they're an honest seeker, they might say, well, okay, that makes sense. How does it work then? Because I want there to be justice, but there isn't. And if your God is good and loving, why isn't there? And you could say, well, what if there's one chapter where the loving, all-powerful God is actually in conflict with an evil character, and the world is the battlefield, and people get to choose which side they're on? So the rightful king has come into enemy-occupied territory in disguise in this chapter. In the next chapter, how does he come? In power. In the next chapter, he comes in power. In disguise, people are free to choose. You can choose what you like. There were the French under Nazi occupation who were part of the resistance. And then when the Allies came, they were vindicated. But there were French who cooperated with the Germans completely. When the Allies came, they said, "Oh, we're with you guys." Now, what did we think of them? We generally prosecuted them, didn't we? So in this chapter, the rightful king is in disguise, and freedom is a privilege. In the next chapter, there's no choosing. There's no swapping sides. In this chapter, you get to see who's on the side of goodness and justice and love and mercy, even if it costs you. So our characters are, in a sense, on display in this chapter. So we said Mere Christianity was a series of broadcasts. The BBC actually asked Lewis to talk to the people. Why? There's a war on. Can I say crap? They're getting the crap bombed out of them every day, which makes them feel like giving up, doesn't it? Yeah, their will was wavering. So how does this stuff help? It gives hope, yeah?
Framework?
Yeah, it's a framework to think about. We're not against the German people, but there is a worldview here that we need to stand up to and oppose, because there is meaningfully right and wrong. And sometimes you need force to oppose evil. So he wanted to galvanise them, and he did. Fascinating, after the war, what happened? The Nuremberg trials. So all the German soldiers, guards, officials, doctors, everyone was tried for war crimes. And what was their defence? I simply did what I was told to by the appropriate authorities. What I did was legal in our land at the time. How did that defence go down? Not well. What do the judges say famously? There is a law above our laws. Which is pretty much what Paul's saying here, isn't it? There's a law that's woven into the fabric of us, in our conscience. Something deep. So those who are under the law of Moses, the Jews, they really knew that they had fallen short. But those who weren't also knew that they had fallen short. There was a moral code. Sometimes they followed it, sometimes they didn't. But that meant they were guilty too. And that's often where our gospel presentations begin, isn't it? That sense that we've all fallen short. But that's where the good news comes in, isn't it? About Jesus. Last chunk. Circumcision just doesn't cut it. Do you like that? So, last bit. A person is not a Jew who is only one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly. And circumcision is supposed to be a circumcision of the heart, by the Spirit, not the written code. Such a person's praise doesn't come from people but from God. We'll keep moving because the kids are in. So what Paul is saying is you can be a Jew on the inside where it matters. A Jew of the heart. Jews are supposed to be God's chosen people. And what it was all about was jumping in on a faith adventure. What was Abraham's asset? His faith. The Hall of Fame is all about jumping in on a faith adventure. Paul is saying, hey, you can jump in on this faith adventure. If you start out as a Jew, fantastic, you found Messiah. If you didn't start as a Jew, that's okay. You can jump in on the adventure too and become a real Jew, a real person of God on the inside. Take on that faith adventure. And such a person gets their affirmation from God, not from people. They're performing for an audience of one. Have you heard the saying, God has no grandchildren? Yeah. What do you think it means? Your relationship with God will either be first-hand, vibrant, alive, growing, real, tangible, vivid, or being near to that isn't the same thing, or not at all. It's not the real thing. It's not enough to be nearby to it. You've got to be on the adventure. Similarly, adherence to some external codes, conduct, actions are not going to cut it because they don't deal with sin. Well, we're not Jews, and this primarily isn't written to us, but the principle is still sound, isn't it? What externals, what might we get caught up in instead of the internal realities? Going to church? Yeah? Being good, good acts. Appearing, yeah. Some places having the right sort of Bible is important. In other places, taking notes during the sermon means you're spiritual. Giving. So giving might be really visible. So you think, yes, I'm spiritual because I'm giving.
Acts of service.
Acts of service, surely.
Not drinking too much.
Yes. All the nots. Or maybe raising your hands in certain setting. Or not raising your hand signifies me as being okay. Preaching a sermon, surely that counts you as okay. Knowing Greek words, doesn't that count? So they're all externals, aren't they? Being baptised, the Lord's Supper, they can become empty external rituals and we can lose the heart of them. And when that happens, we need to go back to the heart. Thinking about this guy now. What happened to this guy? He was repentant, he was humble, he was broken, wasn't he? He was honest before God. This is his saying. Hilastheti. Be hilastheti to me, a sinner. That sound good or bad? Fascinating word, only used one other time in the whole New Testament. And it's translated merciful, but that is a shonky translation. Here it is in Hebrews, that he might do this same thing for his people. The NIV translates it, make atonement, or the ESV calls it propitiation. What is that? Harkens back to the Old Testament picture of a perfect sacrifice making oneness with God. Who's telling the story? Jesus is telling the story. And what's happening in the story? Someone asks for God to forgive him on the basis of an atoning sacrifice. Do you think Jesus knew that was him? Which leads nicely into this, doesn't it? What is communion supposed to do? Sure, it's a ritual, but it's supposed to make us get rid of pride, die to pride, find humility again. Remember that it's the atoning sacrifice that saves us. Might help us when I come out.